I'm most excited for a reader to see themselves as a part of history. To say, hey, I'm a part of this. Madam was doing this 100 plus years ago. I'm doing it now. I'm part of something bigger.
Black, female, daughter of enslaved parents, orphan, widowed young mother. From a penniless migrant to becoming known as America's first female self-made millionaire. Against all odds, Madam C.J. Walker used her generosity to give what she could with what she had, regardless of the circumstances, along the way becoming a significant American philanthropist and foremother of Black philanthropy today. Author Tyrone McKinley Freeman sits down to discuss his new book, Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving, Black Women's Philanthropy During Jim Crow.
I wanted to tell this story to bring to life an important aspect of African American philanthropy. You know, African Americans in particular have been very generous and have been donors and engaged in their communities from the beginning, sometimes by necessity. And so it's not something that's new or something that's absent from the community, but something that's very deeply rooted. It goes back to the beginning of their experience here in America and has its roots actually in pre-colonial West Africa. And so it was important to highlight this, to add to the larger conversation about what philanthropy is, who counts as a philanthropist. Philanthropy as a human phenomenon is a big story, and this is adding another piece to that story. I grew up in a very generous family. I come from Baptist preachers and first ladies, and so growing up in the African American church, which is a philanthropic institution, has been throughout history. It's part of Madam Walker's story too. So I come from the community and experienced that philanthropy firsthand. So I knew that it existed, I knew that it was important, and at the same time, as I was formally studying philanthropy, I wasn't seeing consistent representation or engagement with the history of African American philanthropy. And so there was an opportunity there to kind of bridge that gap. And so Madam Walker was that perfect bridge. We tend to focus on the fact that she was, this business owner and very successful during the Jim Crow segregation period. And then we say, oh yeah, and also she gave to charity. Well, I was really interested in that part too. And so I would say, what did that mean for her to give to charity? What was she trying to do? Where did it come from? She was somebody who was very much connected to helping others. And so when we tend to think about philanthropy as something that's about the surplus. You do it when you have extra time, when you have extra money. But for her, it was this kind of fundamental aspect of her daily life. It's almost philanthropy as a way of being, giving of yourself and sharing as a way of being. And so you'll see the story unfold of how Madam Walker was involved in the anti-lynching movement, in the temperance movement, in the women's suffrage movement. She was funding and supporting schools at a time, again, when education was segregated and African Americans didn't have access to quality schools. She was supporting social services. So you get to see how a community rallied together, pooled resources together, and met its own needs because Jim Crow segregation was intentionally not meeting those needs and intentionally erecting barriers to make life difficult for them. But through their philanthropy, it's one way that they responded to that environment and met each other's needs and fought for broader change. Will be a conversation. I have written this book, Madam Walker's Gospel of Giving, Black Women's Philanthropy During Jim Crow, in order to tell the story of this remarkable woman's generosity. And in the process, what I discovered is that it wasn't her story alone, that it was a story of a community. And that she was very much reflective of the ways in which Black women engaged and participated in the struggle at the turn of the 20th century. And so it sheds new light on Walker as a historical figure, but it also connects her and grounds her in a larger philanthropic tradition that is still very much alive and well today, and the basis for Black philanthropy today, and all the different things that are happening in the community. And it has been an essential part of the struggle for freedom. It existed before Madam Walker. She inherited it from others who came before her. And because of her achievements, she becomes a nice milestone or marker for us to look at to understand it in better context. So let me just say, by way of a little background, I think most people have heard of Madam Walker and her story. She was an entrepreneur at the turn of the 20th century, a Black woman who was born in Delta, Louisiana in 1867, 2 years after emancipation. All of her family members had been enslaved on that plantation, but she was the first freeborn person. And so you could imagine the joy and the excitement that her parents must have felt that their first child was born free in this very cruel world that they had been experiencing. But life quickly became cruel for young Sarah Breedlove, which was her birth name. By the age of 7, her parents had died and she was orphaned and under the care of her older sister and brother-in-law. And this is also happening during the time that we know as Reconstruction. And Reconstruction is when America promised to build a multiracial democracy and extend citizenship and rights to African Americans. But after only 12 years, reneged on that promise and pulled those rights that they had recently extended and that recognized freedom out from under Black people and pushed them into the throes of Jim Crow segregation. And so Sarah Breedlove lived during this tumultuous time, and she began working as a washerwoman. And so in the book, I briefly recount her story of how she goes from those humble circumstances to where she begins to rebuild her life by moving to St. Louis in her early 20s after being married for a short time, having a child, but then her husband dies. So not only was she orphaned, she was widowed, and she's a single mother, a Black woman in an emerging Jim Crow South. So this is devastating, right? But she makes her way to St. Louis in that condition, and along with many other Black migrants who are starting to move out of the South and heading westward towards Kansas and northward to places like Chicago, seeking better opportunities, seeking freedom. The Klan is arising, white terrorism, and all these kinds of racial injustices are just all over the place. And so she lands in St. Louis, and she is received not only by her brothers who were there and who were barbers and had a thriving barber shop, but also by the St. Paul AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church. And so it's during that time the church takes her in, and she is surrounded by church women, club women, women who are doing not only the work of the church, but the work in the community. And they are activists in many ways. They are building orphanages and schools, and they're speaking truth to power regarding the injustices of Jim Crow. And young Sarah is kind of in the midst of all this and seeing a Black controlled institution run by Black people with Black people in leadership, has access to education for her daughter. This is a new world compared to Delta, Louisiana. And so new possibilities begin to develop for her. And so she begins to work in cosmetics. There's another Black woman that we all need to know so much more about named Annie Malone, who had started a company called Poro. And she was selling products through that company. And again, the story kind of goes on. And I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll just kind of give the Reader's Digest version. But after those experiences, she begins to sell her own products under the name of Madam C.J. Walker. That was from her third husband, Charles Joseph Walker. And the company took off. She incorporated it in the city of Indianapolis. So she moved around a lot. And she becomes very wealthy. And her story culminates in 1919 in Irvington, New York, in her 34-room, $250,000 mansion, where her nearby neighbor is Mr. John D. Rockefeller. And so that is not supposed to happen in Jim Crow America. Black people are supposed to stay in their space. They're not supposed to strive. They're not supposed to achieve. And yet here's this woman doing these things. And so the book is really about the role of generosity in that story. Because she became known as a millionaire, and we think about her wealth status, but she was also very generous. She was very philanthropic. And one of the things that I found very interesting, I should also say that my background, I come from this tradition. I was raised by preachers and first ladies, grew up in the church, so I understand this generosity from a very personal standpoint. But on the other side, I also am formally trained. I am a scholar. I have a PhD in philanthropic studies. So I have actually studied philanthropy. And so I'm able to kind of bring these multiple dimensions to bear on this. So this book is personal and it's scholarly. It's practical and it's academic. It's past and it's present. Because along my journey, I also was a professional fundraiser. So I have raised money in the nonprofit community for youth and family social services, for community economic development. I also worked for a Big Ten higher education campaign. So I have experience with fundraising. I come from the community, but I also know how to study these. So it's kind of all of these perspectives that I bring to bear in the book. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to know more about why she was giving, how she was giving, and where all that came from. And what I point to in the book is a conversation that Madam Walker was having with the great Booker T. Washington, the controversial Black leader of the times, the leading Black leader in many ways. Though, of course, not all of Black America was happy with him and his accommodationist stance, but he was a leader nonetheless. White political leaders, he had their ear. White philanthropic brokers, he had their ear. He is a major force to contend with. And Madam Walker did all she could to try to get close to him, to try to get his endorsement for her business. And so she also started giving to Tuskegee, his institution in Alabama, rather. And in the opening of the book, I recount this exchange between them, where Walker had talked to Booker T. Washington about a $300 scholarship to support students at Tuskegee. And get this, for all of you who have students in college, that $300 would have supported 5 students and still would have had $50 left over for the general fund. That doesn't happen anymore, right? But she's talking to him about this gift. And in the midst of the conversation about this gift, these are in letters, Booker T acknowledges the gift, but is kind of urging her to do more. Can she do more? Well, she receives that as an insult. And she writes back to him and says, well, wait a minute, we talked about $300. Now you're saying that this is not good enough. You want me to do more? I don't understand. We had this agreement. Why are you changing? And so she kind of goes back and forth with him. And then she says something very important to him. She says, I am unlike your white friends who have waited until they were rich and then help, but have, in accordance with my wealth, and reaching out and supporting others. And what she's saying there is not to compare her to Washington's white friends like Andrew Carnegie, the well-known philanthropist of the era, who had funded Tuskegee to the tune of $600,000. Carnegie is known for building a company and accumulating massive amount of wealth, but then later turning to philanthropy near the end of his life, right, in his later years. And so she's saying, don't interact with me in that same way. That's not the model I'm following. I'm doing something different. And there's another major philanthropist of this era named Olivia Sage out of New York, who her husband was a Wall Street financier. And during their marriage, she was very constrained. The sexism and the marital norms were such that she could not do what she wanted to do with her life philanthropically. But after he died and she inherits millions and millions of dollars from him, she literally goes on a philanthropic giving spree. She starts funding colleges and opens up universities for women. She funds the environment and social services. But again, this is out of this idea of leisure, and that she, as a quote unquote kept woman, had a responsibility to do things with these resources. But she inherited that wealth, right? Madam Walker didn't have anyone to inherit wealth from. She was actively creating and building the wealth that she was beginning to give away and trying to address the needs of the race. And so she's saying very directly to Booker T. Washington, don't compare me to Carnegie, don't compare me to Sage, see me for who I am. See me for what I'm trying to do. And she says, I want to give you thousands of dollars, but right now I can only give you hundreds. Kind of work with me. And I think that's very powerful. When I saw that in the archive, that began to change the tide for me, and I began to see what she was trying to do. And so I articulated that as her gospel of giving. This idea that you give along the way. You do not have to wait. You do not spend your life accumulating wealth and then later turn yourself to matters of concern for others. That you can give now for what you have and still have impact and still have meaning. And that's very much how philanthropy developed across her lifetime. Her first documented gift is from that time in St. Louis when she was this poor, widowed, struggling migrant with a young daughter in tow, trying to get her own rounds. And she begins to raise money and collect food for sick neighbors in her neighborhood. And so this idea that philanthropy can grow with you, is something you can give along the way, is what I want to articulate and is really the focus of this book. And so the arc of the book is telling this story, and the chapters of it are divided up into the different kinds of gifts that she made. And in the Black tradition, money is an important gift, but is not the only gift. And so there's one chapter on money, but all the other chapters are on other aspects of Black philanthropy, giving the gift of opportunity, giving the gift of education, giving the gift of activism, and leaving the gift of a legacy. And so that's kind of a brief overview of where I try to go. And this understanding this history is important for givers today. It's also important for organizations today because America's demographics are changing. People of color have always been engaged in philanthropy. And now there is a greater recognition within that community that it wants to be understood as a philanthropist, and it is asserting itself. There's so many organizations and so many developments on today's landscape of philanthropy that I wanted to write this book to tell this history, to show how it's alive and well today, not only in the Black church, but in giving circles and donor advised funds amongst the high net worth Black folks, but also amongst everyday givers in the community. And that's what I'm striving to do with this book.
Conversation, which is Tyrone. One of the things that you talked about, Tyrone, in your book, is this whole notion of moral imagination,
Mm-hmm.
and that her moral imagination was really what informed her philanthropy. Would you talk a little bit about the whole notion of moral imagination? For I think that's something that's a kind of concept that I've heard before.
Sure. Yeah. So the idea of the moral imagination is really that part of us that sees the world as it is, but then wishes for something more, wishes for something better, that there are issues, there are causes out there that need attention. And the moral imagination is the way in which we dream and hope to make that better. And we think about the kinds of actions we can take to bring about that new vision. And so when we think about people giving philanthropic donations to organizations or to causes, we often think about what's behind that. Why are they doing that? And so the moral imagination is a way to think about our notions of right and wrong, our notions of what's wrong in the world and what needs correction, and then how we give of ourselves to address those. And so I use that in the book to tell the kind of the story of the transition from Sarah Breedlove to the kind of, again, the orphaned, widowed, poor, struggling migrant, to Madam Walker, the race woman, which is a term that means someone who's for the race and by the race and trying to uplift the race out of the scourge of Jim Crow's racism and sexism. And the moral imagination was a useful tool for doing that because I showed the different institutions and relationships that help to foster that in her. And so I mentioned the AME Church is one of those. We talked about that a little bit earlier. Being in these networks of women is where some of this comes from, because she's surrounded by women, whether they're washerwomen, they're church women inside the church, club women outside the church in the community, providing social services or education, or even fraternal women, because she joins a fraternal order a little bit later in her life. Women in all of those spaces are asserting their moral imaginations. They're trying to deal with sexism within the church or within the community, and they're dealing with racism outside. And they're starting programs, they're trying to address the need, and they're asserting their own definitions of womanhood, which is also under attack by Jim Crow. And so for Sarah Breedlove to be amongst this, I saw a shaping of her own sense of responsibility to others and a socialization of her into this tradition of giving, that she's learning to give, learning to be an activist, learning to help and engage others based on what she has at any given time, by being in community with these other women. And so the moral imagination is a tool that can give us access. And when we think about that today, one of the things I do with my students is I have them write an essay. I'm a professor, I'm assistant professor of philanthropic studies at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, the world's first school of philanthropy dedicated to the study and teaching and training of philanthropy and researching of philanthropy. And so I often have my students write an essay about their moral imagination so we could tease out the kinds of issues that are important to them, the kinds of experiences they've had that shape them, and the things they need to be cognizant of as they go out into the world and try to make change. Because even with good intentions, one can cause great harm. And so the moral imagination also has this underside that can lead to critiques because there can be sometimes intended or even unintended consequences of one's gift. And so for Walker, it was a useful tool of trying to bring to bear, where did this sensibility and responsibility to give come from?
How can what is in your book now be useful to nonprofits and social service organizations that are trying to deal with the challenges of trying to find money to keep their organizations? You know, everyone's challenged right now during this whole point of COVID, and so funding is drying up. So, is there anything in there that, if I were an executive director at a nonprofit, that I could take away from this that would be helpful to?
Yeah, so one of the things that I often say is that history is a very underutilized tool in fundraising. That we often talk about giving histories and organizational histories, but history itself is instructive. And so one of the things that the professional world of fundraising has done in recent years, it has labeled communities of color and donors of color as new and emerging. And the problem with that is that's incorrect. They're not new and emerging. They've been giving from the beginning. And in fact, the tradition that I write about goes back to pre-colonial West Africa. So it's bigger and larger than American racism or response to that. It's something that's fundamental in this culture. But the problem with a label like new and emerging is that is an external lens looking at the donors rather than understanding them on their own terms. As I mentioned earlier, Madam Walker wanted to be seen on her own terms. Donors today want to be understood on their own terms. So they might be new and emerging to an organization that has not catered to them, that has not paid attention to them, or not known how to engage them, but they are not new and emerging on the landscape of philanthropy. They are already and have been funding their own institutions. And even in this moment where billions of dollars are being poured into racial equity causes, Black donors are leading the way. Many of the high net worth gifts that have come from some of the African American high net worth individuals in the community. But even when we look at things happening at the grassroots level, funding that's going to many of the bail funds and the movement for Black lives and others coming directly out of the community. And it's extraordinary that many of the GoFundMe pages for the victims of this police violence over the past 6 months have broken records. George Floyd's GoFundMe page has broken records for GoFundMe. It has raised the most money ever. Right now, of course, a local neighborhood-based nonprofit can't replicate the kind of attention that horrific incident got. But it speaks to the propensity of everyday givers to respond when something is deemed by them to be relevant and important and essential. And one of the problems the fundraising field has had is communicating culturally relevant cases for support to communities of color and inviting them in. We know from national studies that donors of color report lower levels of cultivation and solicitation than white donors. That is a problem that nonprofit organizations and fundraisers have created themselves. All right, I think about it in two ways. There are organizations that have absolutely no history of meaningfully engaging donors of color. And then there are organizations that have that history, but are trying to expand it or do more. So in the first case, those organizations need to really look at how they do business. They really need to look at how they structure their campaigns, how their organizational culture is or is not inviting and hospitable towards people of color and people from marginalized communities. Donors of color look for representation and power and influence on boards and in staffs. They don't want tokenism. They want to understand that the culture of the organization is open and inviting. So this speaks to the work that this moment is asking many organizations to do, and to fundamentally change some of the operating assumptions that have guided much of what they've done. Also, there can be very arbitrary methods and tools that we've developed in the fundraising world in order to make things work for us on the organizational side, but again, overlook the needs of donors. So very often organizations will set arbitrary amounts, if you will, for different giving levels, and arbitrary amounts for what it takes to establish a scholarship or to support a client, but not always thinking about what that means for who that can attract and who that opens up opportunity for and who that presents a barrier for engaging. And so in the book, I talk about the Smithsonian's campaign for the National Museum of African American History. I was privileged to gain access to fundraisers from that campaign and interview them for it, because again, I saw it as this representation of the power of this tradition. And when you look at the story of how that museum came to be, how the Smithsonian hired African American fundraisers who had expertise in fundraising and came from some of the top institutions in the country that had success in doing this. But then they intentionally developed strategies for communities of color. They did all the traditional things. They interacted with all the high net worth folks that you need to do, and they captured people that, again, organizations listening to us today wouldn't be able to capture likely, right? Oprah, Robert F. Smith, everybody wants them. They're hard to get. They did that work, but what they did is they paid attention to everybody else beneath those levels of giving. Oprah gave 21 million, Robert F. Smith gave 20. They said, what about everybody else? And they were very intentional in creating an introductory level of giving at the $25 level that went up from there. They were blown away at the over 100,000 people who responded at that giving level, and collectively they raised millions and millions of dollars. They also initially started asking themselves, who could give us $25,000? And that was a relatively small list. But when they flipped that and said, well, wait a minute, who could give us 25,000 off the bat, who could give us 5,000 per year and work their way up? That little shift opened up a whole new universe of donors that they never even considered before. And the response at that particular level has been overwhelming. Over 1,000 people gave at that level, and they've collectively raised over $5 million for the campaign. But again, it was shifting those amounts and thinking about it from the donor perspective, right? Not the organizational perspective. And even the donors that they attracted, there was people from all backgrounds, but a significant number, and perhaps even a slight majority of them, are African Americans. And they've continued to do work with this level, lots of programming, and to cultivate, and they've continued to attract people there. And many of these people never even thought of themselves as philanthropists in that traditional sense before. So there was this eagerness to participate, which started with this culturally relevant case. And it continued with reshaping the campaign in ways that opened up opportunity for more people rather than fewer people to give. And then it extended out to other, right? Money is not the only thing in this instance, right? They needed volunteers. They had to shut down the volunteer docent program because there was too many people. So many people were touched and wanted to be a part of this history and give of themselves. They had to shut it down. And if you've ever been, I had the chance to take my family. It's an extraordinary experience, and the docents are so proud. Many of them are elderly African Americans who experienced much of the history that's in the museum. Their shoulders are a little bit straighter and taller, and they're there to comfort you and support you through the journey, but because they tapped into a message that meant something to them. They also, and I'll leave this and then go to your next question, they procured over 40,000 items for the museum. And then, so these people donated over 40,000 items. And so again, the idea that people literally went underneath the bed, into the attics, into the basements, into the garage, and felt enough trust, felt welcome enough, felt valued enough to turn over their family's history so that the museum would actually have artifacts to showcase. I think this is a model of the inclusive kind of campaign that all of us can learn from, regardless of the scales at which we're operating, regardless of the missions that we have, because what they literally did was they created equal opportunity for everyone to give and everyone to participate, instead of only focusing on the elite and what they could do.
Tyrone, where's the book available? How can we buy the book?
Oh, well, the book is available wherever books are sold. And so it is published by the University of Illinois Press, which is a nonprofit press. They have a website. It is available on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, pretty much wherever you get books. Your local independent Black bookstores, I would add, they can get it for you as well. So it's available wherever books are sold.
Who is the audience that you've directed this effort toward?
Yeah, thank you. So while I was writing this book, I was in conversation with many different communities. So I mentioned I'm a former fundraiser. I'm a scholar of philanthropy. So I interact with fundraisers on a regular basis and people in the advancement world. I speak regularly to groups like giving circles and to community foundations. So I was talking to grant makers as well. But I always kept in mind that the person I was writing for was a Black woman, late 20s, early 30s, on up, 60s, 70s, who is, has education, has experiences, working, but also very much engaged while raising her family, while living her life, be it through a church, be it through a sorority, be it through whatever kind of network. And then I always kept this woman in mind as I was writing, because I thought that this was her history in particular, as this tradition has really been birthed through Black women and extended to the broader community. And so I thought if I could get that right, and target her and focus on what she's interested in, then I would get the rest of it right, because it's her tradition, so she should know. But then also the fundraising audiences that I wanted to speak, they're all trying to understand her. They're all trying to understand donors of color. And there's this great move amongst African Americans in the world of philanthropy, who are standing up and asserting their identity as philanthropists. There's a vibrant social media world and so many networks where people are declaring that they too are philanthropists, whether it's through giving circles or capacity building groups or what have you. And so I very much wanted to speak to these different audiences, and I focused my attention by writing to and directly for Black women.
All right, so you focused on Black women. Is there anything in there for Black men?
Yes, I think it's for us to understand, again, their particular role in developing this tradition, in supporting our institutions, right? And understanding that, again, this has been something that's been generational. Each generation has done it. And so just as Madam Walker was doing it back then, 120 years ago, women were doing it before her. If you look at the movement for Black Lives, it was founded by 3 Black women. If you look at the current global celebration of Black Philanthropy Month, which is the month of August, it was created by 3 Black women. If you look at who's leading Black America to the polls in a few weeks, it's the women of the Divine Nine, because they're excited about Kamala Harris being on the ticket, right? So it recognizes Black women's ongoing generosity and role. And I think that's important for us as men to recognize that, because that has sustained institutions. We have often been the more recognizable figures. We talk a lot about Martin Luther King, and when we give Rosa Parks some due, but there are a lot of women behind all of that work too that haven't gotten their due. And so it's important to recognize that as they were asserting their womanhood, motherhood, redefining that, because Jim Crow asserted a particular attack on Black women, calling them immoral, calling them lascivious, and questioning their sexual morality and all these kinds of things that they were fighting back against as they were doing this work. So I think this gives us a way of seeing them in their whole history and seeing how they have contributed their whole selves to our liberation, because they very often they've been foundational to the movements that have freed us, and the movements that we continue to push forward to deal with these ongoing issues regarding our liberation.
Well, you put the book together in such a way as to talk about, in the first chapter, the sources of her moral imagination and the totality of her life. So I think that one of the things that is very helpful to people is that it's a good history. You have done a marvelous job in telling our story and telling our story from the perspective, as you said, of African American women, and also from the perspective of how African American women and African American women have struggled to be together, given the influences of the larger culture in terms of defining masculinity and defining femininity and defining the roles. So I think that that's a very, very important kind of thing. And you said earlier that you ask your students to kind of write a paper where they look at their moral imaginations. And so one of the things that would be helpful, I think, to folks if they read that first chapter, if they read the first chapter, would be to say, okay, here are the sources of my moral imagination, and to do some self-reflecting on all of us parts, to look at, say, what have been the influences in my life that have shaped me into the person that I am, that have given me the vision, that helped me to look at what is, and to say, is there something that could be, and develop in me the capacity to want to give myself to that. I think in your credits, one of the things that I found to be very, very heartwarming is that most of the time when authors give credits, they give credits to they can do credits in a half a page or a page. It took you 3.5 pages to give credits, and so what you did in that acknowledgments was to really kind of outline the people sources that God, and institutional sources that God used to inform your moral imagination. So I think that by reading the acknowledgments, by reading the first chapter of Madam C.J. Walker, it perhaps would provide an opportunity for us to begin to look at what informs our own moral imaginations. And I think that's a very important thing to do, because most of us never think about that.
Yeah, no, I wanted to, at the risk of leaving someone out, I felt compelled to try to document the people that have been a part of this as best I could, and any omission is on me, but not reflective of what my heart was trying to do. And so I start with family, because again, I learned this in my family. My parents, Reverend William McKinley Freeman and First Lady Carolyn Cooper Freeman, raised me in this tradition in Union Baptist Church, and the other Coopers and Freemans are all church women, club women, and and church men and leaders in different ways. And so I was immersed in that, and I come out of it. But then when I think about that community, that church community, right, there was so many people poured themselves into me and my sister and my cousins and all of us that kind of come through with that generation, that again, we're kind of a reflection of this tradition, because that's what produced us. So I had to pay homage to that, because that's why I knew it existed, even though the professional space of fundraising doesn't acknowledge it, and even though the academic space wasn't acknowledging it. And so that's where it started for me. And then I'm a graduate of an HBCU, Lincoln University, Pennsylvania.
I want to just stop you right there.
Okay.
You write very beautifully. Your passion comes through. There is a poetic dimension to how you write. The book is written very well, and that grows out of your education at Lincoln University, and a real sense of, because there's part of the story that is not told, is that you started out in physics.
Yes.
And then you made a decision that you really wanted to focus not on physics but on literature, writing, and English, and you gave up a full scholarship in order to pursue that, and your parents supported you in that, and has come forth in terms of this product, and it's worth reading just for the beauty of the writing, and that affirms our historically African American colleges, and because we tend to think that if we want our children to get a quality education, and education that will launch them and empower them, that they need to go to European American universities. And so your book and your accomplishments speak well of what God can do through the historic African American colleges, and that speaks to the need that we have to be supportive of those financial at all levels to produce the product that we have. So I think that was and then talk about the people who poured into your life in terms of speaking. You said they spoke positively, they spoke and they created in you a desire to be like them, and I think that's really really important. And you talk about Madam C.J. Walker in that way. You said that in the first chapter you talk about opportunity. You talk about how women praised her because they said she gave them by her example and by the creation of her company and by the opportunities that she created, both to have businesses, to do industrial education in a northern model, amen, opportunities to see themselves in some different kind of ways and to open themselves up in some different ways. And so I think it's important for us to read just to get a sense of what can happen, amen, if we see, amen, and begin to value ourselves and value the gifts that we have and use those gifts in relationship to each other in the larger society.
And great. And I want to jump in here because we have a question from the Bronzeville Historical Society that came online, and I think it's relevant that Bronzeville is a significant neighborhood in Chicago, and the question comes in that has your scholarly work noted the gospel giving? Have you looked into the role of benevolent societies in the church?
Yeah, yes. So what I do in the book is kind of just, again, show a little bit of the evolution of this. I call it the ethos of giving in the community. And I note the different kinds of institutions that are part of that. And so, and we know that, the AME Church, for instance, right, comes out of this kind of benevolent society, the Free African Society, that was this mutual aid group that after they were kicked out of the Episcopal Church, they started their own services. They started education and social services. And interesting today, just as Black folks are part of the essential workers responding to COVID, it was those early members of the Free African Society who were the essential workers responding to Philadelphia's yellow fever outbreak in the late 1790s, right? And many Black people died trying to help the city of Philadelphia get through that, through these networks. And so, yes, benevolent organizations are very important. And the other part of this story that I tell is that Madam Walker actually organized her agents, her sales agents, into benevolent clubs, which is, again, as a nod to this tradition. And she told them, it's not enough for you to sell products, right? That we're not in this just for money. We've got to do good for the race. And so by putting them into these clubs, she helped them come together, helped them get to know each other in their different regions and cities around the country. And then she charged them with doing charity work and activism work. And so there's all these records in the archive about them raising money for the NAACP, donating furniture to Black colleges. Collectively, they wrote a resolution to President Woodrow Wilson demanding public policy protections against lynching. So even these working class women who, again, are usually locked out of opportunity, right? Madam Walker is empowering them and kind of influencing their moral imagination, right? And challenging them to collectively come together and speak truth to power and use their resources to engage in the race work of this era is how they would think about it. And so, yes, those kinds of societies are bedrocks for this. And incidentally, also in COVID, part of the response in the community to COVID is to come back to mutual aid networks where people are just making sure the neighbor has things and this family member has things. So these are the kinds of things that have sustained communities of color from the beginnings of their history.
I think, Tyrone, that one of the things, we're running out of time, but one of the things that you discuss and stress there is this whole notion of Madam C.J. Walker as a race woman and Booker T. Washington and those as race people. We don't tend to see ourselves in those ways today, and I think that one of the things that would be helpful, again, in reading the book is to explore that discussion and perhaps to provide a way for us to begin to talk about what it means for us to be race people today. We spent a lot of time trying to blend into the larger society, and one of the things that's happened is we've neglected, our own institutions and our own communities as we try to move out. And as we become less race people, it has had a deleterious effect upon upon all of us as Black people and upon the larger society. What was your response to that be?
Yeah, so that generation thought of themselves as race men and women, and even I should say, Madam Walker's general manager and attorney, a Black man named Freeman B. Ransom, he called the company, the Walker Company, a race company, and I think about that as kind of the original FUBU, for us by us. That's what they meant by it, and that's what they were striving for. That this was a means for liberation. And when you look at what other Black entrepreneurs of that era were doing, they also had this same idea that I have a responsibility through my business to do what I can do. And so, yeah, for them to say and think about themselves as race men and race women, that's part of their moral imagination, that they are uplifters and that they have to those who don't have, they're trying to help and they're trying to bring down Jim Crow. The challenge to that is we also know that there were class differences. So many of the uplifters actually were a little paternalistic and a little negative in looking at their dear brothers and sisters, the downtrodden, right? And so historians and others have kind of called them to task for that. And so it's a reminder that even as we seek to do good, we have to be mindful of the assumptions we bring to the table. We certainly have to be careful about entering into communities to try to help. We need to understand how that community wants to help itself and how that community thinks about its own needs and how we might assist and co-create rather than come in and do and demand. And so I think this idea of a race man or race woman is really a synonym for philanthropist in that time frame, and it's what I use to try to unlock and tell this history and its relevance today.
All right, we got a video that we want to show as we close out. Again, I think that it's important to remind folks that the book is available. And it's available on Amazon. It's available at bookstores. It's available in paperback. It's available in electronic forms, Kindle and other forms. And it's well worth reading. And it's well worth reading together and talking together. One of the things that we're going to try to do is to develop a study course for use in our church and in our state convention, making use of this resource. And I think that they're good ways. Some of the questions that folks have certainly will be answered if they take the time to read the book. You've done a marvelous job, almost too good, at telling us what's in the book. But I hope that our imaginations have been whet so that we'll want to go out and buy the book, and we'll want to read the book, and we'll want to allow God through this piece to inform us as we grapple with what it means for us to be practitioners of extravagant generosity in terms of the totality of our lives today. So you have made a wonderful contribution, and I certainly am grateful for it. And I believe that anybody who takes the time to read it will be greatly benefited and helped by it. And I want to say that you've written it in a way, amen, that we can get it and that we can understand it. So.
This book will forever change the way we understand Walker's importance and provides a much-needed context for contemporary calls for economic justice. Award-winning historian Tiffany Gill. Freeman's work opens the door for a more inclusive and more meaningful analysis so that Black philanthropy is a feature rather than a footnote of American philanthropy. Award-winning journalist, author, and Madam Walker's great-great-granddaughter, Alelia Bundles.
This isn't only an African-American story, this is a human story. And so I think that there are things that readers from all backgrounds could gain, because again, when you think of the idea that, you can give from what you have right now, you don't have to wait. I think that's one thing that this moment is urging people to do. Take action. There's so many issues. There's so much pain. There's so much struggle. What can you do in your circle of the world, your sphere of influence, to try to impact things? And Madam gives us a nice model to look at and draw some inspiration. Say, hey, what can I do to help move the needle a little bit in the areas where I'm living, working, playing, raising my family, those kinds of things.
At its heart, Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving, Black Women's Philanthropy During Jim Crow, tells a story about how we can give as a way of life to address important issues in our communities. Right now, who you are and what you have in this moment is sufficient to make a contribution. Purchase your copy today wherever books are sold. Also, consider sending one to the generous givers in your life. For more information, please visit gospelofgiving.com.